Network interface cards. They provide the physical connection between the computer's expansion bus and the network cable. They boost the digital signal from the computer. So the computers, what they're talking about here is boosting the digital signal. So circuitry today, we've talked about this in some other classes that you'll get to. So say we have one chip on a computer that's talking to another chip on a computer. And they use very low power and electricity. So what we have is something called TTL, transistor to transistor logic. So transistor to transistor logic, right? So chip to chip communication. Even TTL logic cannot survive this distance from one chip to another. That TTL logic is only going to work inside of the actual chip. It's a very low power, low noise. That's why they're susceptible to electromagnetic interference and radiation, things like that. So even to talk from one chip to another, TTL is not enough. I have to go to something like an RS422 or an RS232, a serial connection. So the transistor-transistor logic comes into another little tiny chip that communicates across the circuit board, even an inch or two, and then over to the other receiver serial port on the other side. So that's a serial communication from chip to chip. And then we have these high-speed buses that are more powerful and things like that that can bridge those connections, but those are typically found inside of a chip, to and from memory, that kind of thing. But the transistor-transistor logic cannot go very far. So we're talking about that here, boost the digital signals from the computer. So from the computer, inside the computer, there's a digital signal. It may be stronger than transistor to transistor logic, but if any of you are taking digital, that's a good analogy, you know, to understand what we're talking about here. So when it hits the network card, now we're going to boost it up into a real signal that's going to go across that wire, and those wires are wrapped to ensure that the resonance doesn't kill the signal. If you have good resonance, the signal's pretty hardy and it can travel longer down that wire. So inside of a networking cable, you have shielded and unshielded twisted pair. The wires are twisted because every time the signal travels over a loop, it kind of gives each other signal a boost. So they're kind of feeding off of each other and they can go longer and longer and longer. That's why these cables can be pretty long. If they weren't twisted, they wouldn't be able to go that far. So the twisting is all about resonance, and you could read about that, the electrical properties of it if you're curious about it. But the network card to network card communication also has devices in the middle, right? So you have switches and stuff like that. Every time the signal hits a switch, it regenerates the signal. So you can't go more than 1,000 feet or meters, depends on the type of networking and the communication protocol that you're using. So once it hits the switch, it's regenerated. Now it can go another 1,000 meters or whatever the standard length is for that type of gear, right? So these devices will regenerate the signal, but it's much stronger than what you see inside the motherboard, and that's what they're talking about here. Boost the digital signal from the computer. That's what they mean. So the third bullet is change the data stream from wide stream to narrow stream, like parallel to serial conversion. That's what we talked about as well. So you have a bus to bus. You're trying to communicate a lot of data from one chip to another. And it has to go through a serial communication because the signal has to be regenerated. That's why. It doesn't have enough power to survive the electrical, just straight wires across that circuit board, right? There's not enough power in there to do that. So what you have to do is you have to come up with something else. And the way they did that is serial communication. So they'll put a serial chip, RS232 chip right by the chip, so the signals can live to make it to the serial port, and then they go out serially, one byte at a time. So say if you're trying to transmit the word timber across a bus, T-I-M-B-E-R, you could send it all at once. Boom, that's fast. Now I can send words all at once up to that amount of letters at a time, right? But in a serial communication, I have to send the T, then the I, then the M, then the B, then the E, then the R. So it's much slower. So we have high-speed serial buses and things like that. Universal serial buses like USB, things of that nature. So that's why these things exist, because chip-to-chip communication, the TTL, the transistor to transistor logic, cannot survive that. The signal will fade away, and the other chip listening will never hear anything across that wire, even though they're directly connected and they might be an inch apart. It's not enough power for the transistor to transistor logic.